The floor of the Winnipeg livestock auction house hadn't been cleaned in years. You could tell by the way the overhead lights caught the dust, not floating, just hanging there, suspended in the cold air, like everything else in that room had agreed to stop moving. It was a Tuesday in early November, and the people who'd come out that morning weren't there because they loved animals. They wore cargo vests and carried laminated bidder cards. Some of them had clipboards. Two men near the back wall spoke quietly into phones, nodding at numbers that meant nothing to anyone else in the room. This was business, efficient, cold, completely ordinary. The auctioneer, a heavy-set man named Bill Hadwick, stood on a raised wooden platform at the front of the warehouse, shuffling through his lot sheets with the bored authority of a man who'd done this every second Tuesday for 19 years. Beside him, a whiteboard listed the morning's lots in black marker. Lot 38 through Lot 44 were grouped under a heading that read, RCMP Working Animals. Reeted surface. Nobody paid much attention when the side door opened and a young woman walked in alone. She was maybe 26, 27, hard to place exactly. She wore a canvas jacket that was a size too big for her, the kind of thing you grab off a hook near the door on a cold morning without thinking about it. Her hair was pulled back, not styled, just out of the way. She carried a canvas tote bag over one shoulder and looked around the room the way someone does when they know they're in the wrong place and have decided to be there anyway. A few of the men near the front glanced at her. One of them leaned toward his neighbor and said something. The neighbor shrugged. She found a spot near the middle of the room, standing rather than sitting, and she unfolded a single sheet of paper she'd been holding in her jacket pocket. It was worn at the creases, like it had been folded and unfolded many times. She read it once, then tucked it back into her pocket without looking up. Her name was Sophie Allard, and she had driven 4.5 hours from Thunder Bay to be here. Bill Hadwick moved through the first few lots with practiced speed. A pair of German shepherds from the Lethbridge detachment, retired drug detection, good temperament. Both went quickly to a handler from a private security firm in Calgary who'd driven out specifically for them. An aging Belgian Malinois who'd served 9 years in border services went to a rescue coordinator from Saskatoon who paid more than she probably intended to. The room had a rhythm to it, the kind that made you feel like you were watching something deeply impersonal pretend to have stakes. Then they brought out Lot 43. It took 3 people. That was the first thing everyone noticed. 2 handlers came in from the side corridor, each holding the end of a heavy-duty control pole, the kind you use when a leash isn't enough. Between the poles, straining against both of them with the controlled fury of an animal that had decided a long time ago that it would not be handled quietly, was a Belgian Malinois unlike any of the others they'd seen that morning. He was large for the breed, heavier through the chest, broader at the shoulder. His coat was the dark fawn and black-masked color typical of a Malinois, but one ear sat differently than the other, the right one slightly torn at the edge, the cartilage healed at a wrong angle. A pale scar ran from his left jaw down his neck, about 7 centimeters long. His eyes were amber, alert, and completely unafraid. The third person, a younger female handler named Constable Obi, walked behind him with a second lead clipped to his collar as a safety. She looked uncomfortable, not afraid exactly. More like she'd been the one assigned this particular task, and she was already thinking about when it would be over. The dog's name, Bill Hadwick announced, was Phantom. He had served with the RCMP's emergency response team for 6 years. Prior to that, 2 years of operational service with a Canadian Armed Forces military police unit deployed to an undisclosed overseas posting. His handler, Staff Sergeant Raymond Allard of the ERT Western Division, had been killed in a vehicle accident outside Edmonton 8 months ago. Phantom had been in the kennels since then. Bill Hadwick read this from his sheet, the same way he read everything else, with the flat intonation of a man reciting lot numbers at a grain auction. But several things happened in the room while he was reading. The two men near the back with the clipboards exchanged a look and made notes. Retired officer, near the left wall, took his cap off and held it in his hands, and Sophie Allard, standing in the middle of the room, went very still. She had known Phantom since she was 19. Her father had brought the dog home once, just for a weekend, a training integration weekend, where handlers were encouraged to expose their working dogs to domestic environments. Raymond Allard had driven up to Thunder Bay, where Sophie lived with her mother, and Phantom had sat in the back seat of the truck the entire 4 hours, his muzzle resting on the top of the seat, watching the highway go by. He'd been 3 years old then. She remembered thinking he looked like a small wolf, who had decided for reasons of his own to tolerate the situation. That weekend, Sophie had made the mistake of eating cereal at the kitchen table and leaving her bowl on the counter. Phantom had knocked it onto the floor and eaten the remaining milk while staring at her with the serene confidence of an animal that understood exactly what it had done and did not feel any particular way about it. Her father had laughed until he had to sit down. She'd seen Phantom maybe 4 or 5 times after that, on visits to the detachment, twice at Christmas when her father drove up. He was never warm exactly, not the way family dogs were warm. He was professional. He permitted things. But there had been moments, quiet, private moments, when Phantom would sit beside her without being asked to, and she'd understood, in the way you understand things without being able to say them, that he considered her within the circle of people worth watching over. Her father had died on a Thursday in March. A driver had run a red light on an icy intersection outside Edmonton, and Raymond Allard's truck had gone into a concrete barrier at 63 kilometers per hour. He had not survived the night. Sophie had driven down alone to travel. She'd identified him, signed forms, driven back. She hadn't cried until she was past Dryden, when she pulled over on the highway because she couldn't see the road anymore. She'd thought about Phantom the whole drive home. Kept thinking, someone has to go get him. It had taken her 8 months to find out where he was. 6 different phone numbers, 3 written requests, 2 formal inquiries that went unanswered. The RCMP's process for retiring working animals was documented, technically, but navigating it as a civilian, as a handler's daughter, with no official standing, had felt like pushing against a wall that didn't have a door. She'd finally reached someone at the kennel facility, Snorter, who'd told her, not unkindly, that Phantom had been assessed for rehoming and deemed unsuitable for civilian placement. His aggression metrics were too high. His history of handler-specific bonding made him unpredictable with strangers. He was being processed for auction, offered first to registered security companies, then to the open auction if there were no bids. The woman on the phone had said she was sorry. Sophie had written down the auction date, location, and lot number. She had driven to the bank the next morning and asked about a personal loan. She had $4,200 in her tote bag. She had no idea if it would be enough. Bill Hadwick started the bidding on Phantom at $500, which, even for the room, felt vaguely indecent. The first bid came from one of the clipboard men. Private security, Sophie assumed, or a training outfit that used retired working dogs for demonstration purposes. They bid the way people bid when they consider themselves the only serious party in the room. Quickly, confidently, without looking around. The second bid came from someone near the wall that Sophie couldn't see. The number climbed, 700. 9, 1,200. Sophie raised her card. The clipboard man looked at her for the first time. Not with hostility, more like confusion. The look a person gives when an element appears in a situation where they hadn't expected one. 1,500, 2,000, 22. She bid 25, he bid 28. The room had gotten quiet in the particular way rooms get quiet when something unexpected is happening and everyone has decided to watch. Phantom, for his part, had not calmed down during any of this. He was still straining against the poles, not frantically. He wasn't panicking, but with a focused, persistent resistance, like he was simply maintaining a position he'd decided was correct. Constable Obi had moved the backup lead to her other hand and was standing with her feet wider than they'd been before. At 3200, a man near the front had turned around in his chair to look at Sophie directly. He was in his 60s, silver-haired, with the upright posture of someone who had spent decades in uniform. He looked at her for a long moment, then looked back at Hadwick. He bid 4,000. Sophie felt the number land in her chest like a stone. She had 4,200. She bid 41. The clipboard man shook his head and dropped out. The silver-haired man turned around again. This time he didn't look at Hadwick, but he looked at Sophie. "Who are you?" he asked. Not aggressive, genuinely asking. The room got even quieter, if that was possible. "Sophie Allard," she said. "Raymond Allard was my father." What happened next was something that Sophie would spend the rest of her life trying to describe accurately to people who hadn't been in the room, and never quite managing it. Not the gradual settling of an animal that's losing energy. Not the cautious pause of a dog reassessing its environment. He stopped with the sudden completeness of a machine that's been switched off, all that straining, constant tension simply gone. Both control poles went slack simultaneously. Constable Obi took a half step forward out of reflex, then stopped. The dog turned his head. He turned it toward Sophie, and then he sat down, right there on the auction house floor, between two handlers who were still holding their poles as if they'd forgotten what to do with them. Phantom sat down and looked at her. His ears, one torn and one straight, were forward. His amber eyes were completely still. Bill Hadwick stopped mid-sentence. Nobody bid for 34 seconds. Sophie counted. She knew this because she was doing the thing she always did when she was terrified, which was count things to keep herself from going somewhere she couldn't come back from. The silver-haired man, whose name she would later learn was Chief Superintendent Arthur Fontenot, retired, stood up from his chair. He picked up his bidder card and turned it face down on the seat. "I withdraw," he said to Hadwick. There was a logistics problem, which was that Phantom still could not be safely approached by anyone except certified handlers, and Sophie Allard was not a certified handler. This was pointed out by at least 3 people in the first 5 minutes after the bidding closed. There was also the matter of transportation. She had a 2009 Honda CR-V, with a moderate oil leak and a cargo area that had not been configured for a dog of Phantom's classification. And there was the matter of the paperwork which Hadwick needed to process before any animal left the facility, and which the kennel supervisors, a woman named Constable Bridget Okoro, needed to countersign, and Constable Okoro was at the facility, not the auction house, and wasn't due back until 3. Sophie sat on a folding chair near the side door and waited. Chief Superintendent Fontenot sat down beside her, which she hadn't expected. He had the careful, unhurried way of speaking that she associated with people who had learned, usually through something difficult, that there was rarely a good reason to rush words. He asked her about her father. Not the accident, not the professional history. He seemed to already know those things. He asked her what her father had been like in the mornings, whether he'd been the kind of man who made coffee before he did anything else, or whether he just went straight into the day. Sophie said he'd been a straight-into-the-day person every single morning, and that it used to drive her mother insane. Fontenot smiled. He said he'd served alongside Raymond Allard for 2 years at the Winnipeg detachment in 2011, and that this was absolutely accurate. They sat quietly for a moment. He talked about Phantom like a partner, Fontenot said finally. Not like an asset, not like a working dog, like a partner. Sophie nodded. She knew. The kennels weren't wrong about him, Fontenot said. He wasn't defending the decision. She understood. He was explaining it. He refused entry from every handler they sent. 3 separate assessors. Knocked one of them down, not aggressively, but he got his paws on the man's chest and just wouldn't move. They didn't know what to do with him after that. He was waiting, Sophie said. Fontenot looked at her. He was just waiting, she said again, quieter. Dogs like him don't transfer loyalty, they extend it. The paperwork took until 4:15 in the afternoon. By then, the auction house was empty except for Sophie, Fontenot, 2 kennel staff members, and Constable Okoro, who had driven over from the facility with the transfer documents and a portable kennel in the back of her truck, a practical gesture that Sophie had not asked for but was deeply grateful for. Phantom had been moved to a smaller holding pen near the loading area. He was calmer now than he had been during the auction, though calmer was relative. He paced the perimeter of the pen in a regular circuit. 4 steps, turn, 4 steps, turn. With the methodical repetition of an animal managing something, Sophie stood outside the pen for a while without doing anything. She didn't speak to him, didn't call his name, didn't make the sounds people make when they're trying to soften an animal. She just stood there, with her hands in her jacket pockets, watching him pace. Constable Okoro stood a few meters back, professionally neutral, but Sophie could feel the attention, the readiness. After about 5 minutes, Phantom stopped pacing. He stood at the far end of the pen looking at her. Then, slowly, and Sophie would remember this as one of the most careful things she had ever witnessed, he walked toward the pen door and sat down, not at her, not performing anything, just sitting, close to where she was in the way that meant, "I know you're there." Sophie reached into her tote bag. She took out an old fleece collar, faded blue, the metal ring slightly tarnished, that she'd kept in a box under her bed for 7 months. It had been in her father's gear bag when she'd collected his personal effects. She didn't know if it was Phantom's original collar, or just one of several her father had kept. It didn't matter. She held it against the chain link of the pen. Phantom leaned forward and pressed his nose to it. He stayed like that for a long time. The drive back to Thunder Bay took 4 hours and 40 minutes, including 1 stop outside Ixnas, where Sophie pulled into a gas station, bought 2 bottles of water and a bag of beef jerky she didn't eat, and sat in the driver's seat for 10 minutes without turning the engine back on. Phantom was in the back, in the portable kennel Okoro had lent her. He had entered it without a control pole. He had entered it because Sophie had opened the kennel door and stepped back, and after a moment he had walked in on his own and turned around and lain down. Constable Okoro had said, very quietly, that in 9 years of working with MWDs, she had never seen that. On the highway, Sophie watched Phantom in the rearview mirror more often than was probably advisable. He wasn't sleeping. He was lying with his head up, watching the road through the cargo window, the same way she remembered him watching the highway as a puppy in her father's truck. The same posture, the same patience. She thought about the things that don't transfer when a person is gone. The specific weight of a hand, the sound of a laugh, the exact timing of a joke. All the small, irreproducible things. She thought about how grief was partly the understanding that those things are simply gone, and that you carry forward what you can, and that sometimes what you can carry forward is different from what you expected. She thought about how her father had named him Phantom, because he'd said, "The best ones move before you see them coming." She didn't try to talk herself out of crying. It seemed beside the point. Her mother, Claudette Allard, was sitting at the kitchen table when Sophie came in. There was tea on the stove, which meant she'd known approximately when to expect her. She was 71 and had her husband's reading glasses on the table in front of her. She'd been doing that since March, wearing them to read, and then forgetting they were his, or perhaps not forgetting. She looked up when Sophie came through the door. Then she looked at the door again, at what was standing behind Sophie. Phantom came in without hesitation. He walked across the kitchen floor, his nails ticking on the linoleum, and he went straight to the table. He put nose near Claudette's hand, didn't touch it, just near it, and then he looked at her with those flat amber eyes. Claudette Allard put her hand on top of his head. Sophie didn't say anything either. She didn't. After a moment, Phantom stepped back and walked to the corner of the kitchen near the window. The same corner where Raymond Allard had kept his gear bag when he visited, the one spot in the house that caught the afternoon light until about 4 o'clock. He lay down there. He put his head on his paws. He exhaled, long and slow, the way animals do when they've been holding something for a long time. Claudette looked at Sophie. Sophie looked at her mother. "He was waiting the whole time," Sophie said. Claudette nodded, like she'd already understood this, like maybe some part of her had known it since March and had just been waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. Outside, the last of the November light was going. The kitchen smelled like tea and wood smoke from the neighbor's chimney. In the corner by the window, Phantom's eyes had closed. He didn't pace the perimeter that night. He didn't pace it the next morning either. He stayed close, to Sophie, to Claudette, to the corners of the house that smelled most like the man they'd both been waiting for. And in the evenings he sat by the window and watched the driveway, in the quiet, certain way of a dog who has finally understood that watching over is not the same as waiting. He was exactly where he belonged. And something in the house, which had been holding its breath since March, finally let it go.